to Good evening. I call this meeting to order. A quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 4, House Rule 11, Clause 2H4. The chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote, whether yeas and nays are ordered. The committee procedures for remote hearings remain the same. If you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. Does any member have a question about the procedures for today's meeting or this evening's meeting?
Mr. Chairman, this ranking member boss, I just want to make sure that members do need to know they need to stay on camera, and we're down a couple numbers again. So.
Yes, thank you. Members, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying on camera. If there are no other questions, we will proceed. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. With Veterans Day just around the corner, we meet today to advance legislation that will become part of our annual Veterans Day legislative package. The best way we can honor our veterans' service to our nation is through action, and this committee has been working hard to do that. Today, we meet to mark up 18 bills and back up our thank yous with concrete action. Our country's strength has always been in our diversity, and our veteran population is no exception. Our veterans, each with unique backgrounds and upbringings, are all unified by the same sense of duty and patriotism to serve the country they and their families call home. We owe it to them to make sure that all veterans, regardless of gender, sexuality, race, citizenship, or gender identity, have equitable access to the care and benefits they've earned. And that's why we'll look at bills that's why today we'll look at bills that promote justice for women veterans, create a commission to study the inequities of LGBTQ plus veterans, and help them heal and ensure these veterans have a voice at VA. And we know that VA has world-class research that benefits not only veterans, but the world at large. We'll look at legislation to bolster VA's research capabilities and begin a clinical trial to see how cannabis may help veterans. We'll also discuss legislation to achieve benefits parity for our Guard and Reserve members, support student veterans, and hold VA accountable for its electronic health record modernization project. Our veterans continue to serve our country long after they hang up the uniform. That has been made even more clear by the COVID-19 pandemic. Passing these 18 bills today will help us mark this Veterans Day with action and truly honor their service. And I hope all my colleagues will join me. So thank you. And with that, I now recognize Ranking Member Boss for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're here in the evening to consider 18 bills to improve care and benefits for our nation's veterans. Next week, we will commemorate the brave service of veterans on Veterans Day. I'm glad we will be able to do that, knowing that we have taken meaningful action today on legislation to support them. That said, I have some concerns on some of the bills on today's agenda. Not all of the bills we consider today have gone through regular order. That means the members are being asked to go on the record in support of them without the benefit of stakeholders' views and the full vetting. Other bills on our agenda have prohibitive high costs associated with them, and those costs are not offset. That means that we will ultimately end up on the taxpayers tab and result in a higher taxes and even higher inflation. Now that makes it harder for veterans and other Americans to heat their homes, put food on their tables, fill their gas tanks. As the saying goes, this is no way to run a railroad. Mr. Chairman, I have discussed my concerns about the cost and the lack of regular order many times in prior markups and in our private conversations. I'm starting to feel like a broken record. This is likely our last markup for this first session of the 117th Congress. And I hope that we can agree next year to work harder and smarter to advance good bills out of the committee only if they are supported by regular order and that we have a way to pay for them. Now, I would like also to, and I would be remiss if I didn't share that I'm frustrated that you've declined to include House Bill HR 1217, the Veterans Second Amendment Protection Act, or Congresswoman Mace's bill HR 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act, on today's agenda. When our staff asked for our bill priorities for today's agenda, I instructed the staff to ensure both of these bills were of top priority on the list. It is my hope that Congresswoman Mace's amendment will reflect the text of HR 2326, will be adopted today and become a part of HR 5529 and move swiftly to the House floor. Mr. Chairman, I hope that you and I will be able to work together to ensure that veterans who serve our nation in defense of our freedoms will have the benefit of the same constitutional Second Amendment protection as every other American. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. We will now move to consideration of the bills on our agenda. I call up HR 1836. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 1836.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The first reading is dispensed with and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I recognize Mr. Levin to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1836, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parody Act, at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for purposes of amendment. Mr. Levin, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for including my legislation, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parody Act, in today's markup. This bill would provide parity to members of the National Guard and Reserves by counting every day in uniform that a service member is getting paid towards GI Bill eligibility. We as a nation continue to ask more and more of our reserve component service members, from the COVID-19 response to protecting the Capitol after the January 6th attack. The reserve component has become an integral part of U.S. defense plans as an operational reserve since 9/11, a change from its traditional role as a strategic reserve. More service members from the active and reserve components are now serving next to each other, doing the same job and running the same risks. However, despite both wearing the uniform and serving our country, they often do not receive the same GI Bill eligibility. This is because under current law, service members accrue GI Bill benefits for each day they spend in an eligible duty status. Determining a service member's duty status and the benefits they're earning is often complicated and unclear to the service member. This bill would alleviate that confusion when it comes to GI Bill benefits. Under the ANS, all federal duty statuses except inactive duty for training, also known as drill weekends, would accrue GI Bill benefits beginning in 2025. Beginning in 2032, all duty statuses would accrue GI Bill benefits, including service performed before this date. This ANS ensures VA has the time and resources necessary to expand eligibility. It is the best option before us today to ensure service members can earn eligibility every day that they put on the uniform. That's why it has earned support from the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Student Veterans of America, National Guard Association of the United States, Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States, and the Reserve Officers Association. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in nature of a substitute to the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parody Act, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I strongly support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1836, Representative Levin's Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parody Act of 2021. This bill is a long-needed fix to the unequal treatment of Guard and Reservists for GI Bill purposes who under current law do not accrue education benefits the same, even when they are carrying out the same duties as active duty. These men and women serve our country and bear the same risks, so it is long past due for Congress to finally make every day in uniform count the same. We live in a new age of national defense where we utilize the total force concept with an operational reserve, not a strategic reserve. We saw this when the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in significant National Guard and Reserve activations to support response efforts throughout the United States. It's time the Guard and Reserve benefits reflect the key work they are doing and the need for equity across the total force. Guard and Reserve members need this more than ever as they constantly are transitioning between military, civilian employment, and family life, facing continuous disruptions. If service members can step up and do their part day in and day out, while holding down civilian jobs and squeezing in time to take care of their families, and veterans are funding this, then the least we can do here in Congress is to get out of the way of the solution. Besides just being the right thing to do, investing in equitable GI Bill benefits for Guard and Reservists will provide more than a tenfold return for our country. This bill has the support of a number of veteran service organizations, including Student Veterans of America, National Guard Association of the United States, Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States, and the Reserve Organization of America. I urge all members to support the amendment in nature of substitute to HR 1836. Is there further debate on the Levin amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1836, offered by Mr. Moore.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Moore, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute would replace Chairman Levin's ANS language with the text of my bill, HR 2047. The text would provide additional eligibility for members of the National Guard who are called up on federal active duty orders in service other than training. As a former member of the National Guard, I know all too well the challenges that they face. The National Guard has transitioned in recent years from basically a reserve force to domestic missions to a full-time force operating around the globe. My bill, HR 2047, would remove the presidential declaration requirement that has restricted benefits for so many members of the National Guard in the past. This bill would make it so that members of the National Guard would receive eligibility for the time spent under the federal active duty orders that are not for training. This would provide eligibility for federal benefits to those who support COVID-19 relief, respond to a federal natural disaster, and protect our southern border. I agree with my good friend Chairman Levin that we must take a hard look at the duty status reform and the expansion of benefits afforded to the National Guard and Reserve component while operating under federal active duty orders. My amendment would make it clear that if you're called up on federal orders or something other than training, you should receive your GI Bill benefits. However, I'm concerned that the expansion proposed in his bill is a little too broad. We should allow DoD to complete their efforts to better align benefits to certain duty statuses before we move forward with such a large expansion. I also think it would be a good idea for the subcommittee on economic opportunities to have the legislative hearing on the expansion of these benefits so we can hear from the VA and the outside stakeholders what impact this will have on our National Guard. We need to have a discussion on how effectively expand these benefits for federal service in a way that is also fair to the American taxpayer. We have been told that the expansion to every day in uniform could cost over $2 billion over the next 10 years in mandatory benefits, where my expansion is closer to $20 million. I also share the concerns of many of my colleagues that the offsets that are proposed in the underlying ANS should be saved until we have a better idea on what the committee is going to do about toxic exposure benefits. We should also be asking the questions on if this issue is the best place to spend $2 billion. Should we be prioritizing improving benefits for service-connected disabled veterans or extending the successful vet tech pilot programs? These are the type of questions that could have been addressed in a legislative hearing on it. I'm also concerned that by putting the bulk of the cost of this proposal outside the budget window, we do not truly understand the real impact on our deficit. With that, I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment in the nature of substitute HR 1836, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moore, and I thank the gentleman for offering his amendment. However, I must strongly oppose. Chairman Levin's amendment in the nature of a substitute would bring parity to all Guard and Reservists. The Moore amendment instead would only cover specific cases under specific designations. I appreciate Ranking Member Moore covering cases for national emergency designations. That only scratches the surface of the time commitment of our Guard, it only scratches the surface of the time commitment that our Guard and reservists make. Every day in uniform should count, not some days for some reasons. It's time to bring real parity, and that is why I oppose the Moore amendment. Is there further debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm in support of Congressman Moore's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Congressman Moore's amendment recognizes the shifting role of Guard and Reserve and would authorize service on federal active duty as qualified service for the post 9/11 GI Bill. Under current law, this type of service only qualifies if it is in support of a national emergency declared by the president. This has made the DoD jump through extra hoops to ensure that service like that in support of COVID-19 pandemic relief, the defense of the Capitol, or the support for our southern border qualifies for the GI Bill. Congressman Moore's amendment also clarifies this eligibility so that if a member of the National Guard is called up on federal orders to perform federal service for other than training, they receive eligibility. His amendment is a reasonable alternative to the underlying bill and amending the amendment being offered by Congressman Levin. I believe Congressman Levin's notion to exceed the GI Bill benefits to service members by every day in uniform merits discussion, but I cannot support it at this time. Unlike most of the bills on this agenda, this bill has not gone through regular order. Moreover, despite asking for text of the amendment for weeks, we only received that text 3 days ago. When reviewing a massive benefit expansion like the one we're proposing in this amendment, we should do our due diligence. That means we must have the benefit of a legislative hearing, receiving the views of the relevant veteran service organizations and the administration. I know that some will say we had regular order on a version of the bill last Congress, but that isn't the same. Over half this Congress committee members did not serve on this committee last Congress and have not had a turnover in the administration, and we've also had a turnover in the administration. Additionally, I am pleased that the majority is breaking with past tradition and is identifying identifying pay-go offsets for the estimated 2.3 billion this bill will cost. I still have cost concerns. While many of our offsets my Democrat colleagues have proposed are responsible, I believe we should be saving the few offsets at our disposal for the ongoing discussion related to toxic exposure veterans that we said we would. We know that the Congressional Budget Office that benefits and services for toxic exposure veterans could potentially cost hundreds of billions of dollars. That said, despite marking up the chairman's toxic exposure bill over 4 months ago, we're still no closer to the solution on that front. It would be irresponsible for us to use up all the accessible bipartisan offsets on this bill, when my and the chairman's number one stated goal to address the needs of toxic exposure veterans has not yet been accomplished and comes with such a high price tag. In contrast, Congressman Moore's amendment would provide additional benefits to recognize the important role of the Guard and Reserve playing in our military in a fiscal responsible way that keeps most of our known offsets intact. I encourage members to support Congressman Moore's amendment and oppose the underlying amendment in the nature of a substitute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there further debate on the amendment? Hearing none and seeing none. The question is on the amendment by Representative Moore. All those in favor of the Moore amendment, say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further discussion on the Levin amendment in the nature of a substitute? Not seeing any further discussion on the amendment, on the nature of amendment, the nature of a substitute. The question is on the Levin ANS to HR 1836. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Levin amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1836 is
Mr. Chairman,
agreed.
I request the yeas and nays.
A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second? There's a sufficient second.
Second.
There being a sufficient second, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to Rule Committee 4. Further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. I recognize. I can. That's only if we had approved it, right? I now call up HR 3944. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 3944, to amend Title 38 United States Code to
The
ensure
text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules and without objection. The first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize Mr. Pappas to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3944.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Mr. Pappas, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Takano, for recognizing me and for including this important bill as part of this markup. It's a bipartisan, bicameral bill, HR 3944, the Burial Equity for Guards and Reserves Act. Now, currently, members of the National Guard and Reserves who swore the same oath as their active duty counterparts and were prepared to sacrifice their lives if called upon are not recognized as a veteran by VA when they pass away. As a result, the brave men and women of the Guards and Reserves are denied the honor of being laid to rest next to their brothers and sisters in arms. Current law states that in order to be buried in a cemetery under the control of the VA's National Cemetery Administration, the NCA, a veteran must meet certain requirements. Broadly speaking, they must receive an honorable discharge and serve at least one complete period of active duty. For members of Guards and Reserves who don't serve on active duty, they can meet the existing requirements so long as they serve for at least 20 years. The 20-year service requirement effectively bars members of the Guards and Reserves from being buried in cemeteries under the control of NCA. So as shocking and confusing as that might sound, this arbitrary distinction deprives members of the Guards and Reserves of making their own choice about an extremely personal decision, and it's allowed under current practice. At the same time, states own and operate their own state veteran cemeteries, and they can determine their own policies about who qualifies for interment. But veteran cemeteries that obtain grant money from the NCA, which most do, have to abide by the NCA's policy on who qualifies as a veteran. So the result is that state veteran cemeteries can't inter Guard and Reserve members, even if they wanted to, which is another arbitrary constraint on their ability to serve veterans and to honor the wishes of veterans and their families. For one of my constituents, this means that despite her 16 years of honorable service in the New Hampshire Army National Guard and the Massachusetts Army Reserve, her service doesn't meet the qualifications needed for burial at our state veteran cemetery. So passing this legislation would both honor her service and give her the honor of sharing a place of burial with her father and family members. Her father was recently laid to rest in that facility. My bill fixes this problem, ensures that honorably discharged men and women of the National Guard and Reserve components can be laid to rest in state veteran cemeteries. And it simply says that if a state veteran cemetery chooses to inter an honorably discharged member of the Guard or Reserve or their spouse or child, that the NCA can't withhold money for that reason. The bill doesn't force VA to modify their policy of interment, nor does the bill force state veteran cemeteries to inter anyone that they don't want to. I've worked really closely with leaders of the New Hampshire National Guard and our New Hampshire State Veterans Cemetery on this bill, and the New Hampshire veterans community that came to me with this idea, all who have praised the policy change as long overdue and really life-changing for their members and those that they support. I think this is a simple, common sense fix. I urge adoption of this, and I think in keeping with the last piece of legislation that we considered, which looks to give equity to Guard and Reserve members, this is another step that we can take, and is really the right thing that will guarantee long overdue equity to members of the Guard and Reserve. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pappas, and I urge my colleagues to support HR 3944, the Burial Equity for Guards and Reserve Act of 2021. I would like to thank Representative Pappas for introducing this bill, which prohibits VA from withholding cemetery grant money from any state cemetery, veteran cemetery, solely because they may choose to inter a veteran who does not meet NCA's definition. Many members of the Guard and Reserves are effectively barred from being buried in veteran cemeteries simply because they served during a period in which there were limited calls to active duty for Guardsmen and Reservists. They too signed a blank check to the government and sacrificed time away from their families and stood ready and willing to serve their country at war if the occasion arose. This small change upholds for each individual state the ability to decide who they choose to inter in their state veteran cemeteries and removes any potential barrier for those states who may wish to open their application process. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Is there further discussion on the Pappas amendment? Ranking Member Boss.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
I recognize Ranking Member Boss to offer his amendment. The clerk will designate the substitute amendment.
Substitute for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 39.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, under the Veteran Cemetery Grant Program, the department provides grants to states, tribal organizations to develop and expand veteran cemeteries in underserved areas. The grant program is intended to supplement VA's national cemetery system. Because VA is providing federal funds to expand access to federal benefits, VA requires grant recipients to establish the same eligibility criteria as the national cemeteries. Under current statute, veterans must have a minimum of 2 years of active duty service to be eligible for burial in a national cemetery. I understand that it may be difficult for some National Guard and Reserve members who wish to be buried in a state veteran cemetery to meet this standard. I have also heard that some states want to provide this burial option for ineligible National Guard and Reserve members. HR 3944 would prohibit VA from rejecting a state's application for a grant if the state inters National Guard and Reserve members who do not meet the maximum service requirements. However, I am concerned that HR 3944 creates 2 classes of veterans by allowing states to lower the eligibility criteria for those interred in VA grant-funded state cemeteries compared to those buried in national cemeteries, rather than creating an inequality among veterans interred in federal-funded veteran cemeteries. We should examine whether or not the current burial eligibility criteria is fair for all veterans before making changes to it. Moreover, states do not have to receive VA grant to establish a cemetery. In fact, states are able to inter ineligible National Guard and Reserve members in their cemeteries, provided that the state alone bears the construction and operational costs. But if the state chooses to receive a VA funded, receive federal VA funding, the state must comply with the VA criteria. My amendment would stipulate that the states would receive a VA grant, can bury ineligible National Guard and Reserve members in cemeteries, but only in the sections that were funded solely by the state resources. This would allow us to take a closer look at the eligibility standards for burial in federal funded cemeteries before expanding it. In the meantime, states would not be penalized for interring certain National Guard and Reserve veterans in areas of the cemetery that are funded solely by the state. I urge my members to support my amendment, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Boss. However, I cannot support your amendment, your substitute for the amendment in nature for substitute to HR 3944. The men and women in the Guard and Reserve who have spent the last 20 years either preparing for, deploying, or returning home from war are worthy of being buried alongside veterans interred in local and state cemeteries who receive National Cemetery Administration grants. The intent of this amendment seems to be in conflict with the legislation you have previously co-sponsored and supported to help Guard and Reserve members gain home loans and better access to employment and education. To say that not one penny of NCA grant funds used to help with upkeep and maintenance for state and local cemeteries can be spent on land where Guard and Reserve men and women are buried is wrong. I urge members to vote no on this amendment. Is there any further debate on the Bost amendment? I do not see any member indicating wanting to be recognized. Okay, so if not, the question is on the substitute amendment by Ranking Member Bost. All those in favor of the Bost amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there any further discussion on the Pappas amendment in nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on the Pappas amendment in nature of a substitute to HR 3944. All those in favor will say aye.
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 I think it'd be close.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the Pappas amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 3944 is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 3944 as amended be reported favorably to the House.
All those in favor of reporting favorably to the House, HR 3944 will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Chairman, I request a roll call on that bill, on that.
A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second?
Aye.
Yeah, so there being a sufficient second, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to Committee Rule 4. Further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. The committee will now proceed to consideration of HR 5603. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5603 to amend Title 38 United States Code.
Next was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Representative Underwood, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored that today's markup includes my Protections for Student Veterans Act, an important bill to ensure that service members using VA education benefits are not punished for their ongoing service to our country. For more than 75 years, the VA's education benefits have helped veterans pay college tuition, find the right school or training program, and access career counseling. Thanks to these important benefits, veterans have been able to transition from military service to successful careers in a range of industries. Yet for too many student veterans, a period of active service or inactive duty training could mean grade reductions, failing grades, and even financial penalties. It is unacceptable for a veteran to be punished for their ongoing service to our country. I'm thankful that my state of Illinois has taken action to right this wrong, and I am proud to be the lead sponsor of the Protections for Student Veterans Act, which builds on Illinois' example and ensures that service members in every state can continue their education without penalty if they are called to serve. My bill, which is supported by the Student Veterans of America, will implement several common sense protections for students using VA benefits, including a prohibition on assigning failing grades or other punishments for service members who receive orders to begin active service or training. My bill would also ensure that students who are called to serve are refunded for tuition and fees for incomplete academic terms and have opportunities to resume their studies when their service is complete. These are basic protections that make good on our promises to veterans and honor the ongoing sacrifices made by our service members. I thank Chairman Takano for including the bill in today's markup, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation. Our veterans deserve nothing less. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ms. Underwood. Introduced on October 15th of this year by Representative Underwood, the Protections for Student Veterans Act amends the Service Members Civil Relief Act, which provides broad protections for active duty reservist and National Guard service members during deployments. Representative Underwood's bill enhances protections for members of the armed services of the armed forces who must suspend their education to fulfill military orders. Many states, including Representative Underwood's state of Illinois, have stronger student protections for service members than what exists at the federal level. There are currently few federal protections for members of the armed services who are enrolled in higher education when they receive active duty orders. These service members can be held liable to repay tuition and may also receive failing or incomplete grades as a result of suspending their education for military duty. I hope we all can agree that this is an unfair penalty to those members of the armed forces who are preparing for their future through education while also serving their country. The protections proposed in this bill will cover unexpected withdrawals due to military orders and unexpected withdrawals due to military orders, and can provide a restoration of benefits and reimbursements for classes. This bill takes the best practices from around the country to make sure student veterans aren't left with debts or incomplete classes outside of their control due to military orders. I urge all members to support HR 5603. Is there further debate on HR 5603?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to offer an amendment to HR 5603 that was noticed to be offered by Congressman Cawthorn, who is now currently not available because of a delay in the markup.
Without objection, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HR 5603 offered by Mr. Cobb.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, in lieu of Mr. Cawthorn, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment, HR 5603, would insert the text of Congressman Cawthorn's bill, HR 4874, the Fly Vets Act, to the underlying text. The amendment would close a long-standing loophole in current law that allows some contract flight schools to charge unlimited amounts of tuition fees. The bill would place a responsible cap on the tuition and fee payments through the post 9/11 GI Bill for any training, including flight training, pursuant to the third-party contractor at a public school. This cap would be equal to the cap on the tuition and fees for private and non-private for private and nonprofit schools. In addition, this new cap This amendment would also allow a student to receive accelerated payments for flight training. That would allow the doubling the cap on tuition and fees for a little over $52,000 per year. By doing this, the student would utilize 2 months of eligibility for every 1 month of training. In fact, on average, almost all GI Bill flight school students in 2020 would not be impacted by the cap on tuition and the fees, and all the students would be covered by the accelerated options. The bill also has 2-year delay effectiveness date to ensure that the current students are not impacted. I'm also pleased that the cap on the tuition fees has been a legislative proposal under multiple administrations and has broad support from veteran service organizations. The text on this bill has passed out of the House by unanimous votes in the 114th, 115th, and 116th Congress. I want to thank Congressman Winthrop, Chairman Takano, Congressman Levin for their work on the previous Congresses. And I thank Congressman Cawthorn for his advocacy on this issue here in this Congress. And I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, HR 5603, and I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman, you're muted.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I support this amendment. Is there any further debate on this amendment? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment offered by Ranking Member Bost in lieu of Mr. Cawthorn to the amendment to HR 5603. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
I move to report HR 5603 favorable to the House of Representatives as amended to the House of Representatives.
Thank you for catching that, Ranking Member Bost. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on HR 5603 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. I now call up HR 4591. Clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 4591.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Mervan to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 40.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for purposes of amendment. Mr. Mervan, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. In July, the Technology Modernization Subcommittee held a hearing to discuss the results of 2 reports from the VA Office of the Inspector General highlighting VA's failure to conduct a reliable life cycle cost estimate for the Electronic Health Record Modernization Program. Specifically, the IG repeatedly found unreliable and incomplete estimates for upgrades and costs, as well as inadequate reporting, which has affected transparency to Congress. Given the size and the scope of the EHRM program, the lack of accurate cost estimate hampers VA's ability to provide Congress with an accurate picture of the cost and scale of the real need to modernize IT and physical infrastructure at VA medical centers. My bill, the VA Electronic Health Record Transparency Act of 2021, will address these issues. The bill will require VA to look at all costs across VHA, OIT, and any other program for any amount expended on EHRM, including for infrastructure projects. The amendment I am introducing today will also require VA to provide the committee with reports on performance metrics and outcomes. I know I am interested in finding out the true cost of this large modernization program, and I know this bill will help us get that information. I want to thank Chairman Takano and Ranking Member Bost, who are both co-sponsors of this bill, as well as the other co-sponsors that have made this truly bipartisan effort. I hope that every member of this committee will support this bill. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mervan. This bill promotes good governance and will enable Congress to conduct better oversight and hold VA accountable for its spending. It is essential that we ensure that taxpayer funds are being used properly and that VA is maintaining detailed records of its IT and physical infrastructure expenditures. I support this measure and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there any further debate on the Mervan amendment?
Mr.
Chair,
Who's seeking?
Representative Miller Meeks.
Thank you. Thank you. Representative Miller Meeks, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Takano. Hopefully I will take much less time than that. I just wanted to thank Representative Mervan for bringing this very important bill forward. As a physician who was on the cusp, and then as a state health director who was helping with our health information network get off the ground in the state of Iowa. This is a very important bill. We know that the VA has struggled with getting up to task its electronic health records. And I think this is a very important bill to address both accountability, cost spending, and then also to ensure that we get a favorable electronic health record established throughout all the VA systems. So I just want to give my support to Representative Mervan.
Well, thank you, Representative Miller Meeks. Is there any other member who wishes to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I support the amendment in the nature of substitute on HR 4591 and the VA Electronic Health Record Transparency Act. Since the very beginning, the EHRM program, this committee has been requesting accurate and up-to-date life cycle cost estimates from VA. Despite our request, VA has never provided a credible life cycle cost estimate. VA cost estimates could not withstand even the most basic scrutiny. This bill will require quarterly reports on the cost of EHRM program, and it would also capture the roughly $5 billion of cost the Inspector General found where unaccounted for, and the other costs that VA has not been including. Of course, cost is not everything. The electronic health record needs to help VA medical staff better care for our veterans. That is why the bill also requires VA to report on performance and safety matrices. These data points will allow us to evaluate the program and determine whether it is making VA medical centers safer, faster, and better. Now, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the bill, and I look forward to its passing the committee and the House. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Any other member wish to be recognized to speak on Mr. Mervan's bill? Seeing none, let me just say, Ranking Member Bost, Chairman Mervan, and Representative Rosendale, I appreciate the bipartisan spirit in which the last oversight hearing was held. I think we share a bipartisan interest in trying to get this right. In the spirit of our former chairman, Phil Rowe, in establishing the Tech Modernization Committee and my insistence on continuing it, I think we are sending a strong message that VA needs to get this right. And this legislation is also another powerful statement. If there's no further debate, we'll move on to the question. And the question is on the Mervan amendment in the nature of a substitute HR 4591. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Mervan amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to report HR 4591 as amended favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr.
Without
Chairman.
objection, go ahead, Mr. Boss.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 4591 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. I now call up HR 2250. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 2250 to amend title.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. Representative Rosendale, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your bill.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. When I began serving on the Technology Modernization Subcommittee, I was horrified to discover that Congress has been shoveling roughly $8 billion a year into the VA information technology with very little useful information about how it's being spent. To be sure, every year VA produces hundreds of pages in its budget requests about IT and major projects. But when we examined it, we found very little relevance to what was actually happening. That's why I introduced HR 2250, the VA IT Reform Act of 2021, to start collecting basic, reliable information on VA's IT projects to help this committee to make better informed decisions. I want to thank Mr. Mervan, Mr. Banks, Ranking Member Boss, and our counterparts in the Senate for working with me on this legislation. Specifically, the bill would require the VA to report on major IT projects, cost estimates, schedules, and performance goals before they began and before any money was spent on them. If the project is approved, that information would then become a baseline that progress is measured against annually. I believe if we had all of this information now, several of the VA's major IT projects would be canceled. Some may never have even been started at all. The bill would also put an end to the VA Financial Services Center's autonomy in managing IT and moving systems under the purview of the Chief Information Officer. Last year, the Financial Services Center's recklessness allowed cyber criminals to reroute and steal millions of dollars in community care payments. The conditions that allowed this to happen need to be stamped out. Additionally, my legislation would require VA to provide the committee with copies of the IT portfolio reviews that it already conducts, as well as the information it already submits to the Office of Management Budget for the government-wide IT dashboard. There is no good reason for this valuable information to remain under lock and key. Since I introduced HR 2250 in March, the majority and minority staffs have worked with the VA and the Senate to negotiate additional language pertaining to VA's budgeting. This additional language makes the information in VA's budget requests about IT projects of all sizes more relevant, accurate, and detailed. It's included in an amendment in the nature of a substitute that I appreciate Ranking Member Boss offering today. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rosendale. I recognize Ranking Member Boss to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment of the nature of a substitute to
Clerk-
250.
Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Boss, you are recognized for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Rosendale and Subcommittee Chairman Van for their work on the VAIT Reform Act since its introduction. Congressman Rosendale's bill would give Congress visibility into the VA's major IT projects before they start. You know, finding out about projects after they are underway is simply not good enough. I do not believe we are performing our oversight responsibility when we are simply being taken along for the ride. This legislation will make sure we receive information we need to determine whether to authorize projects. That is how most other committees and major agencies operate. With the VA budget approaching 300 billion, this committee has a duty to evaluate new IT investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. My amendment in the nature of a substitute would add several sections to the bill to improve the VA IT's budget. Specifically, the budget request would now contain a list of all active IT projects, a forecast of proposed unfunded IT projects ranked according to cost, benefit, and difficulty, and a project of the IT funding needs 3 years from VBA, VHA, and NCA. These revisions to the legislation incorporated comments received from the VA, and they have been developed in cooperation with the majority and the Senate. I know that this bill is the product of months of work, and I'm proud to offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to support this legislation. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Boss. This bill is a good first step to address the numerous issues that VA has had with technology modernization and management of major IT programs. And it provides Congress with key information to conduct proper oversight of those programs. The Ranking Member's amendment includes changes that incorporate feedback from VA and our Senate counterparts, and I support the amendment. Is there further debate on the Bost amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I ask to be recognized.
Mr. Mervan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Takano, I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of this bill with Mr. Rosendale. I see this as a great first step to getting better information from VA on cost, schedule, and performance of their major IT programs. As I have discovered as the chairman of Technology Modernization Subcommittee, VA has a long way to go to improve the management and performance of their IT programs. This bill provides Congress with key information to conduct proper oversight of those programs. I hope all my colleagues will support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mervan. I want to ask if there's any further debate on the Bost amendment in nature of a substitute. I don't see anybody wishing to comment further. So we'll proceed to the question. And the question is on the Bost amendment in nature of a substitute to HR 2250. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to report HR 2250 as amended favorable to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those
Aye.
opposed, any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and
Mr. Chairman.
changes in the committee amendments. Mr. Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional and or dissenting views on HR 2250 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of HR 5721. Clerk shall designate the bill.
HR 5721 to amend title.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on HR 5721. Now, I'm very pleased to bring forward HR 5721, the VA Infrastructure Powers Exceptional Research, or VIPER Act of 2021. I'm even more pleased that I was joined in introducing VIPER by Ranking Member Bost. We ask all committee members to support this bill. This bipartisan bill was developed in consultation with scientific groups and veteran service organizations. It gives VA additional authorities it needs to make its world-class research program even more efficient and innovative to improve the lives of the veterans it serves. It's no secret that VA research is a jewel in VA's crown, and we need to ensure that VA can continue to be competitive in hiring the finest scientists to understand, prevent, and treat health challenges veterans face, from the effects of military toxic exposures and chronic pain to post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. I'm thrilled that VA supports the Viper Act. It also is endorsed by several major VSOs, including the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Disabled American Veterans, Paralyzed Veterans of America, Minority Veterans of America, and Wounded Warrior Project. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss HR 5721? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to, I'm sorry. I move to report, have we called the vote yet, Mr. Chairman? I'm sorry. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. I apologize. Mr. Chairman, I would actually like to speak on the bill if I can, sir.
I was wondering about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know you were.
Ranking Member Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to co-sponsor the bill and alongside of you. And VA research program is a credit not only to the department but to the entire nation. I believe our bill will make it easier for VA to conduct the research that veterans require and yield advancements in science and medicine that will benefit everyone. I appreciate working with you on this policy and your willingness to incorporate my language regarding our transaction authority, as well as my feedback to make the bill more fiscally responsible. I'm proud to support this bill here today and hope that all of our colleagues will support it. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Boss. I now recognize you for a motion. Since we didn't have any amendments, we just go straight into this motion.
I make a motion to report HR 5721 favorable to the House of Representatives.
For all those in favor, we'll say aye.
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Boss.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on HR 5721.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. I now call up HR 2916. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 2916 to direct the
Text
secretary.
was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I urge support for HR 2916, the VA Medical Cannabis Research Act of 2021, introduced by Congressman Correa. This bipartisan bill directs VA to conduct a clinical trial examining the effects of medical grade cannabis on the health outcomes of covered veterans diagnosed with chronic pain and or post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans and veteran service organizations have told us that they overwhelmingly support medical cannabis research at VA. So many veterans already use cannabis to ease their suffering. And veterans can purchase medical cannabis in 36 states, and recreational cannabis in 19 states. We simply must equip VA and its healthcare providers with scientific guidance about the potential impacts, benefits, and or dangers of cannabis use to treat chronic pain and PTSD. Now, VA tells us that it is monitoring smaller research projects on cannabis outside VA. This really is not sufficient. The bill directs VA to bring the important methodological rigor of a clinical trial framework to bear on these important questions. We owe our veterans no less. Is there further debate on HR 2916?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Dr. Miller-Meeks, well, first of all, before I recognize you, I wanted first to have the clerk designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 29.
So the text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Dr. Miller Meeks, I now recognize you for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Chair Takano. My amendment in the nature of a substitute would replace the text of Congressman Correa's bill, HR 2916, the VA Medical Cannabis Research Act of 2021, with the text of my bill, HR 2932, the Veterans Cannabis Analysis, Research, and Effectiveness, or Veterans Care Act. Congressman Correa and I have shared a goal of expanding research into the effects of medical marijuana on veterans with chronic pain, post-traumatic stress disorder, and more. And as more and more states legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes, more and more veterans are using it to treat their pain, anxiety, and other issues. It is critical that the Department of Veterans Affairs learn more about how medical marijuana may help or hurt veterans in their daily lives, how it may impact the course of their disease, and how it may interact with their other prescribed medications. Congressman Correa and I agree on all of that, and I appreciate his work on this issue. However, his bill takes an overly prescriptive approach to requiring the VA to conduct research on medical marijuana. I am sure that it is well-intentioned. However, what that would do is unfairly tie the hands of the VA researchers who are responsible for designing and conducting these studies and undermine their work to such an extent as to render it meaningless. Having applied for and received international or Institutional Review Board or IRB approval for clinical research, I know how very challenging and onerous this process is, and a congressional mandate or fiat or approval does not ensure IRB approval at an institution. That may sound like an overstatement, but it is unfortunately anything but. VA's testimony regarding Congressman Correa's bill stated that it is not consistent with scientific merit or evidence and does not align with peer review principles. It would be a waste of time and taxpayer dollars, and even more important, a disservice to our veterans to advance a bill with those deficits, and could mean that the research is not conducted as we all desire it to be. That is why my amendment in the nature of a substitute would replace the text of Congressman Correa's bill with the text of my bill, which would also require VA to conduct research regarding medical marijuana, but would also give VA researchers the flexibility to design that research for themselves. This would help ensure that politics plays no role in the results of this research, and that scientists and researchers, not politicians, inform the VA's work on medicinal marijuana research so that it yields the best and most useful research results for veterans. My amendment contains language to ensure that the VA is transparent and regularly communicates with Congress on the progress and results of the department's medical marijuana research. My amendment is also based on language that passed this committee with bipartisan support in the last two Congresses. It was championed last Congress by the former Republican leader of this committee, Dr. Rowe, who, like me, is also a veteran and a doctor, and who knows how profoundly important it is for veterans in pain and in need that we get this right. I hope that my amendment in the nature of a substitute will receive the same level of bipartisan support today that it has in the past. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miller Meeks. Unfortunately, I cannot support your amendment, which would give VA far more leeway in determining how to study the possible use of cannabis in treating pain and PTSD in veterans. With all due respect, VA could be doing that level of research now and simply has chosen not to. VA's Office of Research and Development can absolutely handle a clinical trial. It already conducts many of them, and it's time to bring the scientific weight of that gold standard approach to the issue of cannabis use. So I ask, is there any further debate on the Miller-Meeks amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Is that the Ranking Member Bost?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. 5 minutes, Mr. Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Dr. Miller Meeks's amendment in the nature of a substitute. And I think, and I do thank her for her work on it. You know, Dr. Miller Meeks' amendment would require VA to conduct research on medical marijuana to help us determine once and for all whether or not it benefits veterans with chronic pain, post-traumatic stress, and other conditions. Her language keeps research in the hands of researchers, which is right where it belongs. Her language also mirrors language that has passed this committee with bipartisan support in the last two Congresses. I hope to say the same this Congress. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any other discussion on the Miller Meeks ANS? Seeing or hearing none, the question is on the Miller Meeks amendment in nature substitute to HR 2916. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Miller Meeks amendment in nature substitute is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further debate on HR 2916? If not, I recognize Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 2916 as amended be reported favorably to the House.
So, Vice Chairman Levin,
Mr. Chairman,
I
forgive me
would
for that.
ask you to remake that motion that.
I move that
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
move that HR 2916 be reported favorably to the House.
All those in favor of HR 2916 being reported favorably to the House will all say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call.
A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second?
Second.
And I heard a second from Mr. Rosendale. Is there a sufficient, a recorded vote is therefore ordered and pursuant to Committee Rule 4, further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of HR 5029. Clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5029 to amend.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. And the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Ranking Member Boss, you are recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support this bill and thank Congressman Rouser for introducing it. This bill would allow families of veterans who died by suicide to seek bereavement counseling at vet centers. Vet centers already provide bereavement counseling to the families of service members who die on active duty. If a service member dies by suicide a week before they separate from service, their family member would be able to get grief counseling from the vet center. This bill would ensure that that same grief counseling is available if the veteran dies by suicide a week after their separation from service as well. While we continue to work to try to stop veteran suicide altogether, we must never forget the loved ones of those veterans who have already lost their lives. My heart goes out to those families. I know that they will never stop grieving the loss of their veteran mother, father, sister, brother, or spouse. I pray that this bill will help them find some measure of solace and support. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I urge my colleagues to support HR 5029, the Expanding the Families of Veterans Access to Mental Health Services Act. HR 5029 would open up vet center readjustment counseling and mental health services to family members who have lost service members or veterans to suicide. In its fiscal year 2022 budget request, VA requested this provision, and I thank Mr. Rouser for advancing the legislation to allow vet centers to serve these family members. We all know how many lives are impacted by a veteran's suicide death, and we also know how important it is to stand with these families as they grieve. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss HR 5029? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
Chairman, I move to report HR 5029 favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
None against. Good.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 5029.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, staff is is able to make conforming, technical and conforming changes to the text. I now call up HR 5516. Clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5516.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I now recognize Mr. Elzey to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HR 5516 offered by Mr. Elzey.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Elzey, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bost, and members, I'm honored to bring House Bill 5516 for your consideration. HR 5516, the Vital Assessment Act, would help provide critical mental health care and support to student veterans by improving the Department of Veterans Affairs integration to academic leadership or VITAL program. My amendment would assure that all student veterans, even those who are enrolled in school without using a VA education benefit, are able to access VITAL. Hundreds of thousands of veterans attend colleges and universities every year. According to the VA, student veterans often have difficulty adjusting from military culture to campus culture, and they have unique needs and experiences that can make college particularly stressful. Veteran students might struggle to relate to their non-veteran peers at school due to differences in age, experiences, and expectations. And 62% of student veterans are first-generation college students. In 2011, the VA launched the Veterans Integration Academic Leadership Program, or VITAL, to provide mental health services to student veterans on college campuses. Since then, VITAL has grown to support student veterans at 183 locations. It's locally managed, staffed, and evaluated by VA medical centers, working with area schools, which allows for independence and flexibility. However, that arrangement does not allow for critical information about VITAL to be tracked by VA central office so that best practices can be identified and the mental health needs of student veterans can be prioritized. So this legislation, the Vital Assessment Act, will ensure information about the VITAL program is collected and analyzed as a means of improving the program. The bill requires VA to report to Congress about VITAL's management, operations, and effectiveness in supporting student veterans' mental health and educational goals, connecting student veterans with needed care and services, and preventing student veteran suicide. It requires VA to use information in the report to establish and disseminate best practices, goals, and performance measures for VITAL and conduct outreach to ensure student veterans and other stakeholders are aware of VITAL. It also requires the VA to assess the feasibility and advisability of including the suicide rate for student veterans in the National Veteran Suicide Prevention Annual Report. The Vital Assessment Act will support student veterans' mental health and help them achieve their goals and dreams. In conclusion, I want to thank Ranking Member Bost for being an original co-sponsor of this bill. Also thank supporters of this bill, including Disabled American Veterans, the American Legion, and it's also supported by stakeholder groups, including the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Association for VA Psychologist Leaders. Finally, I particularly appreciate Student Veterans of America and the Veterans of Foreign Wars in particular for their work on this bill and amendment. I hope that every House member of this committee will join me in voting to report HR 5516 as amended to the full House. Thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Elzey, and I'm pleased to support HR 5516, your Vital Assessment Act. And I support your amendment to broaden the definition of student veteran for the purposes of the bill. VITAL is a long-time program at VA, and this report will be a timely opportunity to examine outcomes, particularly for student veterans and academic institutions supported by VA. So I urge all members to support the amendment to HR 5616. Is there a further debate on the Elzey amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, I want to thank Congressman Elzey. You know, he's the newest member of this committee and my friend and fellow veteran, and for his work on this bill and the amendment. You know, I'm proud to support both today. The Vital Assessment Act will improve mental health care for student veterans. We know that student veterans have big dreams and goals. We also know that student veterans can have big stressors because of their military service, the difficulty of transitioning from the military life to civilian life and the different ages and expectations and life experiences they bring to the school with them. This bill would help ensure they get the support they need. I hope that every member of this committee will vote in favor of this today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Is there any further discussion on the LZ amendment? Seeing or hearing none, the question is on the LZ amendment to HR 5516. All those in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the LZ amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Ranking Member Abbas for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to report HR 5516 as amended favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical conforming changes.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on HR 5516 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of HR 5529. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5529 to direct.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Dr. Miller Meeks, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Dr. Miller Meeks, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I greatly appreciate you including my bill, HR 5529, the Veterans Justice Outreach Improvement Act, on the agenda for today's markup. My bill would make a number of improvements to the Department of Veterans Affairs Veterans Justice Outreach Program. The Veterans Justice Outreach Program works by identifying so-called justice-involved veterans, those who are in jail or who have been charged with an offense that is working its way through the court system, and offering them support and assistance accessing VA care, benefits, and services. Justice-involved veterans are at an increased risk of becoming homeless, suffering from a mental health condition, and dying from suicide more so than other veterans. These are men and women who have served their country and our country, and their current legal troubles may be the result of or worsened by their service-connected conditions or the time they have spent in uniform. The Veterans Justice Outreach Program throws them a much-needed lifeline, and in coordination with veterans treatment courts across the country can help them avoid jail time altogether, have a reduced sentence, and or get them healthy and back on their feet after their debt to society has been paid. However, the Government Accountability Office recently found serious deficiencies in VA's management of the Veterans Justice Outreach Program, the hiring and training of Veterans Justice Outreach specialists, and the identification of justice-involved veterans. As is often the case, sadly, those deficiencies were greater for rural communities where we know we have a significant proportion of veterans reside. My bill would correct the problems that the GAO identified with the Veterans Justice Outreach Program, help better serve justice-involved veterans in rural or underserved communities that are located far from VA medical center campuses, and improve outreach and communication to justice-involved veterans, stakeholders in veteran and criminal justice communities, and Congress on Veterans Justice Outreach and VA's involvement with Veterans Treatment Court. This bill is supported by the Veterans of 4 and More, the Disabled American Veterans, the American Legion, the Student Veterans of America, and the Association of VA Psychological Leaders. I appreciate their support. I also want to give a special shout out to Veterans of 4 and More, Student Veterans of America, Student Veteran Fellow Eric Sowers, whose hard work on Veterans Treatment Courts contributed greatly to this bill. Eric is a fellow veteran, and I'm grateful for his advocacy and leadership on this issue. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm offering this afternoon strengthens the underlying bill by incorporating technical assistance from GAO based on their recent work and feedback from Chairman Takano's staff, our Senate colleagues, and other stakeholders. I am proud to support this important bill and amendment today. I hope that all of my committee colleagues from both sides of the aisle will join me. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miller Meeks. I do urge my colleagues to support your amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5529, the Veterans Justice Outreach Improvement Act. Some of you may not know a lot about this program, but VA has about 400 specialists who work with jails and municipal courts to identify and assess the needs of arrested or incarcerated veterans with the goal of connecting those veterans to VA healthcare services. Many of these veterans are not aware that they are eligible for VA healthcare. I think this is a very important program at VA and one that needs increased attention, evaluation, and resources. Is there, Dr. Ruiz, I see you. Do you wish to be recognized, Dr. Ruiz? I don't see this. Your hand was
No,
up.
sir, that was an automatic hand raise that my iPad picked up when I did something here. So sorry about that.
Oh, okay, I did.
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman Mace, I have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Yes, of course. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
The
substitute.
text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Congresswoman Mace, you are recognized for 5 minutes to speak on your amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. My amendment would include the text of my and Ranking Member Boss Bill, HR 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act, to the underlying ANS, which I support. I was forced to offer this amendment tonight when HR 2326 was not included in today's agenda. The full committee on violent extremist groups made two things very clear when we had that hearing a few weeks ago. First, we're missing crucial data that would help us understand the scope and severity of veteran involvement in online and violent groups. Second, recruitment by extremist groups is happening as we speak right now, and it's often happening online and on social media. HR 2326 would address both the need for more data by requiring a study by an outside entity and our desire to empower veterans by providing useful resources to make informed decisions online. Every day that we delay this legislation is another day that veterans are not being provided helpful information and researchers are not studying the extent to which this issue is pervasive among our military veterans. We all know this, and the reason I'm so sure our bill would be helpful is because the VA took it upon themselves to partner with an organization called Cybercrime Support Network to provide resources and information to veterans about the cyber risks that they're facing online today. This type of partnership is exactly what our bill would create, and the VA's decision to pursue it under their own authority highlights their need for cyber risk awareness resources. I congratulate the VA for their proactivity, but it does not mean that HR 2326 is redundant or unnecessary, because this bill would also require the very important study of veterans and their actual cyber risks. And when we had that last hearing a few weeks ago, we didn't get a lot of that data. And that data is not being collected now, at least sufficiently for this committee, I believe, to make, poignant and important policy decisions for veterans. So the text of this amendment is supported by the disabled American veterans, veterans of foreign wars, student veterans of America, paralyzed veterans of America, and the Wounded Warrior Project. I hope, it is my great hope, that this overwhelming support that we have for this bill and this amendment is clear that we need to adopt this amendment. Anything otherwise, I feel like we'd be playing politics. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the representative for offering this amendment. However, I must oppose it. The VA is already partnering with a nonprofit organization to provide education for veterans about cyber risks. This amendment, as written, was not supported by the VA in testimony during the Technology Modernization Subcommittee. I do support providing veterans with more information on cyber risks. I support what the VA is currently doing to provide that information to them. Is there any further debate on the Mace Amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Miller Meeks for her great work on this bill and for her amendment in the nature of a substitute. Both and the bill on nature of a substitute, both have my full support, and I'm grateful for the work that Dr. Miller Meeks is doing to help our fellow veterans and have who've gotten themselves in trouble and find a better path forward. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's someone who served and sacrificed on our country's behalf. This bill, as amended, would correct deficiencies in the VA's Veterans Justice Outreach Program that were uncovered by GAO and by the veterans themselves. I encourage every committee member to support the amendment and underlying bill. I also support Congresswoman Mace's amendment that would amend the amendment in the nature of a substitute to add the text from HR 2326, the Veterans Cyber Risk Awareness Act. Mr. Chairman, as we learned at our hearing last month, many efforts to recruit veterans to violent extremist groups occur online. This is one of the reasons I joined Congresswoman Mace in introducing HR 2326 earlier this year to help address the risk that the veterans face online. Congresswoman Mace amendment would require VA to partner with other agencies and experts to share best practice with veterans about how to stay safe on the internet. It would also require a study about the cyber risk and veterans face today, like fraud, identity theft, disinformation campaigns, and yes, violent extremism. One of the major takeaways from our hearing last month was that we need better data on veterans and their involvement in extremist groups. The amendment would help provide some of that missing data. Despite my request to include HR 2326 on today's agenda, it was not included. The language in this amendment is supported by disabled American veterans, veterans of foreign war, VFW, the Wounded Warriors Project, Student Veterans of America, and Paralyzed Veterans of America. That's a lot of strong groups in support. And I would help keep veterans, it will help keep veterans safer while protecting their First Amendment rights and finding answers to outstanding questions about veterans and violent extremism. I hope every committee member will join me in supporting Congresswoman Mace's amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I want to just reiterate that, that I support the underlying proposal by Dr. Melvin Meeks, but I do not support this amendment. And if there are any further discussion on the Mace amendment to the ANS. If not, the question is on the Mace amendment to the ANS to HR 5529. All those in favor will say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair,
No.
in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Mace amendment to the ANS is not agreed to.
Mr.
Without
Chairman,
objection, the motion.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second? A recorded vote is, there being a sufficient second, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to Committee Rule 4. Further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. Is there further debate on is there further debate on Dr. Miller Meeks ANS? We are, okay. All right, so we'll just move on to the next one, right? Okay. I now proceed to HR. The committee now will proceed to HR consideration of HR 5671. The clerk will designate the bill.
HR 5671 to authorize the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to furnish seasonal influenza.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. First reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Public health experts have determined that administering COVID-19 vaccines and influenza vaccines at the same time is not only safe, but recommended. And that is why I've introduced language that would modify VA's authority under Save Lives Act which passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate earlier this year, to also provide flu vaccines to the same population. By providing easy access to both vaccines at the same time, I hope we can begin to reduce the burden on the broader healthcare system this winter. These times, the times we live in, are unprecedented, and as a result, we should be open to thinking outside the box to better public health. I hope my colleagues will support this common sense legislation, and I'll recognize Ranking Member Boss to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in nature of a substitute.
Amendment to HR 5671, offered by Mr. Boston.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that you introduced this bill tonight. You and I worked together earlier this year, right out of the gate, for me and as a ranking member, as a ranking member, to expand VA's ability to vaccinate all veterans as well as their caregivers, spouses against COVID-19 in the Save Lives Act. This bill would allow the VA to provide flu vaccines to those individuals as well. The flu shares many of the same symptoms as COVID. Getting more people vaccinated against flu can avoid a deadly winter surge of both the flu and COVID that could further overburden our healthcare system and healthcare workers. And I support that. However, my amendment would limit it to the 2021 through 2022 flu seasons only. VA medical facilities exist to serve veterans with service-connected conditions or without the means to seek care of them elsewhere. There is an opportunity cost for veterans wherever the VA services are expanded to other groups, particularly to non-veteran groups. I do not take that lightly. Expanding services to VA medical centers and clinics to potentially large groups of non-veterans is what this bill will do. That is an extraordinary step. As we continue to come out of this pandemic and get back to life, as we knew it before March 2020, extraordinary steps like this one are appropriate to keep Americans healthy, support healthcare workers, and keep recovery efforts intact. But by next flu season, unless something else goes very, very wrong, we will be in a much better place. At that time, it will be more than appropriate to preserve the VA medical facilities for veterans and have non-veteran spouses and caregivers go get their flu shots elsewhere as they always have before. And, I hope my amendment will have a support of every committee member. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Member Bost. I so appreciate your willingness to work with me on this topic, and I welcome your amendment to my bill. I do regard our work together on the Save Lives Act as one of our finer moments during this session of Congress. I do ask all my colleagues to support the Bost amendment. Is there further debate on the Bost amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the Bost amendment to HR 5671. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to report HR 5671 as amended favorable to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file a minority and supplemental additional and or dissenting views on HR 5671 as amended.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. Let me just say, I do believe that this action, should we be successful on the floor of the House and to have agreement in the Senate, we will save lives. So thank you.
Thank you.
I now call up HR 2385. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 2385.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Chairwoman Brownlee to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment in nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Chairwoman Brownlee, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very pleased to offer this amendment in the nature of the substitute for consideration by the full committee to my bill, HR 2385, the Justice for Women Veterans Act. Through my work as chair of the Health Subcommittee, I've met with countless women veterans whose lives remain impacted by discriminatory policies that were in place during their time in uniform. One such policy discriminated against pregnant service members and was in effect from 1951 until 1976. Women became permanent members of the regular armed forces in 1948 when President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act into law. With the expansion of the military to include women, the possibility arose for the first time that members of the regular components of the armed forces could become pregnant. In 1951, President Truman signed an executive order that granted the armed forces the authority to involuntarily separate or discharge a woman if she became pregnant, gave birth to a child, or became a parent by adoption or as a step parent. In response, the armed forces systematically discharged thousands of women who became pregnant, regardless of whether the pregnancy was planned, unplanned, or was the result of sexual assault. Although the armed forces were required to offer women the opportunity to request retention in the military, few women were granted this opportunity. The armed forces did not provide required separation benefits, counseling, or assistance to these women. At a time when these women needed their income the most, they were summarily fired. The policy was finally rescinded in 1976 following a federal district court ruling that it was deemed that it was unconstitutional. On the Veteran Affairs Committee, we have learned that DoD policies that result in involuntary discharges, such as those that took place under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, frequently result in irregularities that cause veterans to either wrongfully lose access to benefits or be unaware of their eligibility. The thousands of women who were kicked out of the military for pregnancy or parenthood under the 1951 policy should have had the opportunity to have the full careers in the service that they wanted. While we cannot give them back their careers, we can bring them justice by restoring benefits to them and their families, caregivers, and survivors. My amendment directs the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study to identify how many women were involuntarily discharged for pregnancy or parenthood from 1951 to 1976. The study will identify if there were disparities in those separations that took place based upon branch of service, rank, race, and ethnicity. The study will also look at the character of discharge for affected women and identify how their access to VA healthcare and benefits was impacted. Most importantly, the study will provide recommendations for improving access to resources for those women veterans through the Department of Veteran Affairs. Endorsers of this bill include Disabled American Veterans, the American Legion, the Fleet Reserve Association, and Service Women's Action Network. My bill is a first step, and only a first step, in assessing the impact of this discriminatory policy. I'm proud to introduce this bill to correct an injustice against patriotic women who signed up to serve our country, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Brownlee. HR 2385, the Justice for Women Veterans Act, offered by you, directs the Government Accountability Office to examine the plight of service members forced to separate from the military because they became pregnant or parents under military policies during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Congress must address antiquated policies that discriminate against women veterans. However, VA and Congress need to have a more complete understanding of the impacts of these antiquated policies, and GAO would identify the extent to which the Department of Defense and VA maintain data and applied policies from the relevant period. GAO would also analyze the data and among other things, determine how discharges and separations affected women service members' access to VA benefits and care, and make recommendations for improving that access. The ANS makes some minor modifications to the underlying bill, including the addition of an interim briefing to Congress before the final completion of GAO's examination. This legislation is supported by the Modern Military Association of America, Disabled American Veterans, Minority Veterans of America, and the Black Veterans Empowerment Council. I urge all my colleagues to support the ANS to HR 2385. Is there further debate on the Brownlee Amendment?
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman.
I don't dare, you get away with calling me Mr. Speaker. So.
That's all right. I got called general in last night's committee markup. So it was.
Well, we have one speaker. We know who that is. All right. Go ahead, Ranking Member Boss, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment in the nature of a substitute on HR 2385. Congresswoman Brownlee's bill would require GAO to review administrative discharges of pregnant women between 1948 and 1975. The youngest woman in this group is now 64 years old, and the oldest would be over 110 years old. Now, I'm not sure what the review will find or if its findings will lead to legislation. But regardless of the review's finding, this is exactly why this committee has always prioritized well thought out studies over uninformed and rushed policymaking. I believe this GAO review will help VA as it continues the Trump administration policy to review the veteran's character of discharge to see if the discharges can be upgraded. And I'm glad I can support this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Is there further debate on the Brownlee ANS? If not, the question is on the Brownlee ANS to HR 2385. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed will say no.
No.
He says no. Okay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes, in the opinion of the chairs, the chair of the ayes have it, and the Brownlee ANS is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to report HR 2385 as amended favorable to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Boss.
Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and or dissenting views on HR 2385 as amended.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. I now call up HR 5562. Clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5562 to amend Title 30.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. And without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak in favor of Mr. Harder's World War II Veterans Hospital and Medical Eligibility Act, which would make each and every living World War II veteran eligible for VA healthcare. The eligibility criteria to receive healthcare from VA has evolved since the greatest generation served in uniform. And as a result, around a quarter of these veterans are not eligible to access care from VHA. This legislation would exempt them from means testing for VHA, ensuring any and all of the remaining veterans who served during World War II have access to healthcare, nursing home care, home and community-based services, and support for caregivers. Mr. Harder's bill would simply do the same for World War II veterans. We must ensure that those we call our greatest generation are able to live out their remaining days with good care and comfort. It's quite literally the least we can do. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss HR 5562?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be supporting this bill today. You know, surviving members of the greatest generation deserve respect, gratitude, and support. This bill delivers by expanding their eligibility to receive VA care so that not a single one of them will go without the needed support in their twilight years. That said, this bill is yet another reminder for me of the need for review of the VA eligibility system. Eligibility for care in the VA healthcare system is based on certain enrollment priority groups. These priority groups were created in the mid-1990s. Needless to say, we live in a very different world now than we did then. Unfortunately, VA's priority group system has not changed with the times. Clearly, it doesn't allow VA to serve all the veterans we want it to, or there would be no need for this bill today. My bill, HR 1216, the Modernization Veterans Healthcare Eligibility Act, is based on the recommendations from the Bipartisan Commission on Care to create a commission to recommend changes to the VA's priority group system. That would allow us to improve the way VA delivers care to veterans and ensure that no group of veterans is left behind. I hope that my bill can be considered and advanced by this committee very soon. In the meantime, I'm pleased to support this bill today as a gesture of immense gratitude and respect for the veterans of World War II. I would note before closing, Mr. Chairman, that I was very surprised by the preliminary CBO score this bill received. According to CBO, this bill would increase discretionary cost by the hundreds of millions over a 5-year period. I think that's wildly off base. VA estimates that there are 14,000 World War II veterans that would be eligible to enroll in the VA healthcare system in the first year of this bill's enactment. An additional 5,000 would be eligible to enroll in the following year. We know that not all of those veterans would seek VA care, and most of them would continue to use their existing source of health care coverage because we know with their ages in 95 years or above, they would probably want to stay with their existing doctor. But it's no secret that members are bound to comply with the CBO cost estimate, no matter how incorrect we think it might be. It's also no secret that a bill with hundreds of millions of dollars in the cost will not offset and will have a heck of a time passing the House or the Senate. And that's for good reason. But we have a responsibility to be careful with how we spend the tax dollars. But because I believe the CBO score has missed the mark by miles on this bill, we have an obligation to care for the veterans who saved this free world from tyranny in World War II. I will be supporting this bill. That said, I hope that I can work together after the markup, Mr. Chairman, with you to address the CBO's estimate and ensure this bill is fiscally responsible before considering on the field or considering on the floor. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Does any other member wish to speak on this legislation, the Harder bill? Before I move on to the vote, let me just say, Ranking Member Bost, I respect your independent determination, independent of the CBO. I mean, I think we do need a CBO. It's a good guidepost, but there are times when we have to use our common sense. I know that some members of this committee have quarreled with how they score our leases. And you know, many of us would say that even issues that are in front of us tonight with regard to the CBO, we have to use our common sense. So I appreciate, with all jesting aside, Ranking Member Bost, with regard to our greatest generation, we are obligated to follow our common sense and know that CBO estimation is something that we need to take into account, but we also have to do the right thing. And I look forward to working with you. So the question now is on.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
Can I ask, I'm sorry, we have had several people leave. We need to get the quorum present on screen before we take the vote.
So you question the absence of a quorum. All right, members, make sure your cameras are turned on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, a quorum is present, and we both agree to that. Okay, so now we move on to, I now recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
I move to report HR 5562 favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor of reporting HR 5562 favorably to the House will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 5562.
Without objection. And we are one step closer to honoring our greatest generation. I now call up HR 1596. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 1596, to establish the Commission to study stigmatization, criminalization, and ongoing exclusion and inequity for LGBTQ service members and veterans.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Committee will now proceed to the consideration of HR 1596, and I recognize myself to offer an amendment. Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and is considered as read and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. My bill, HR 1596, as amended, would establish the Commission on Equity and Reconciliation in the Uniformed Services. For decades, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and otherwise non-heterosexual, non-cisgender, or LGBTQ plus service members and veterans have faced intense discrimination in the United States military and other uniformed services. This commission would conduct much needed fact-finding on the history of LGBTQ plus policies within the uniformed services, as well as both past and ongoing impacts to military personnel and veterans. Would also provide Congress with recommendations for a path forward that the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs should follow, both to both remedy and to both remedy the harm done and ensure equity for current and future LGBTQ plus Americans who serve our nation. Even as they swore to protect and defend their country, both in peacetime and in war, LGBTQ plus service members face the threat of humiliation, forcible discharge from service, and even violence or imprisonment for being who they were. Women and service members of color were disproportionately impacted and were caught in the crosshairs of existing structures of sexual harassment and racial discrimination, along with the anti-LGBTQ plus policies. Even after the repeal of policies barring LGBTQ plus personnel from openly serving, these members of the uniformed services still face substantial barriers. Further, LGBTQ plus veterans remain underserved by a VA. A report released by the VA Office of Health Equity showed that these veterans are 5 times as likely to be diagnosed with PTSD as heterosexual veterans. However, thousands of veterans remain unable to receive services related to the lasting psychological impacts of their service. A comprehensive understanding of the depth and breadth of the challenges that face this population is critical to ensuring that all veterans receive the care they have earned and deserve. The ANS makes only minor changes, such as to the bill's title and shortening the historic analysis from the 18th century to World War II, adding to the specific policies under analysis, and the broadening of who selects the commission membership. My legislation has the endorsement of the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, Minority Veterans of America, Modern Military Association of America, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, among others. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this important bill. Is there further debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, I will not be able to support this bill to create a presidential commission to review the Department of Defense policies and actions. Now, I understand the intent of the bill. However, there is no need for a presidential commission to review this topic. If any entity were to review the past actions and policies of the military, it should be DOD. And in fact, this is already happening. Unfortunately, we do not have testimony from DOD because they did not testify at the legislative hearing on this bill. VA shares my concern about being pushed into the middle of a DOD effort. VA already has authority to review a veteran's character of discharge to see if the discharge can be upgraded for providing benefits. The Trump administration used that authority to propose new regulations to review the possibility of changing eligibility status for veterans given other than honorable discharges. That included discharges related to don't ask, don't tell, as well as many other reasons, including a diagnosis of PDS. I do not believe this commission is the highest and best use of our resources. As such, I respectfully oppose this legislation, and with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any other discussion of HR 1596? If not, the question is on the ANS to HR 1596. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Takano ANS is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 1596 as amended be reported favorably to the House.
All those in favor of the motion will say aye.
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 Aye, aye.
Any opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second?
Second.
Second.
There being sufficient second, a recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to Committee Rule 4, further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. I now call up HR 4845. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 4845, to amend Title 38.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize Representative Pappas to speak on his bill.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. I appreciate you including this bill in today's markup. It's HR 4845, which would establish an advisory committee on LGBTQ plus veterans at VA. Now, for decades, LGBTQ plus service members and veterans have suffered discriminatory policies while they've served our country. Veterans who served under policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell have been robbed of their VA benefits, and Some continue to run into roadblocks when attempting to access benefits or programs afforded to non-LGBTQ plus veterans. VA estimates that 1 million LGBTQ veterans face unique challenges accessing healthcare, a lack of awareness for services and benefits, and just an overall lower health status. I've spoken with some of my constituents who are part of the LGBTQ plus veteran community about their experiences, and I've found that oftentimes a veteran doesn't get the care they need because they didn't go to the right doctor or they weren't sure that they were able to access these benefits altogether. And so that's why it's really important that we work to address this issue. We've got to make sure that we address the issue of lower utilization of healthcare among LGBTQ veterans, and more needs to be done on this front. These veterans require culturally competent, informed VA programs, staff, and policies that reflect their unique experiences and needs. My legislation would provide these veterans a direct line to the VA secretary by establishing an LGBTQ plus Veterans Advisory Committee that would review and advise the secretary on the department's programs and activities for veterans. The committee's membership would properly reflect the diversity and unique needs of this community by including professionals in fields related to healthcare and other needs unique to the community, at least one lesbian, gay, bisexual veteran with a service-connected disability, as well as at least one transgender veteran with a service-connected disability. Minority veterans and veterans voluntarily and involuntarily separated from service would be included. The committee would submit an annual report to the secretary, which would include an assessment of the needs of LGBTQ plus veterans with respect to VA benefits and programs, and make recommendations for how to better serve the community. So while VA has made progress, certainly, in making inroads with this population, righting the wrongs of the past to make these veterans whole again requires more work. We must ensure that LGBTQ plus veterans and their perspectives are being heard and the community's needs are being met at VA. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I thank you for including it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pappas. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. HR 4845, offered by Chairman Pappas of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, would establish an advisory committee on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer veterans to advise the Secretary. The advisory committee would have an important cross-section of members, including experts in the needs of LGBTQ+ veterans. The Secretary will consult regularly with and seek the advice of this newly formed committee regarding the administration of benefits and other programs. The legislation also requires annual reporting on the needs of LGBTQ+ veterans, a review of department programs and recommendations. It is supported by the Modern Military Association of America, Disabled American Veterans, Minority Veterans of America, and the Black Veterans Empowerment Council. I urge my colleagues to support HR 4845. Is there further debate on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am not supportive of this bill that would create a new advisory committee on LGBTQ veterans, and I'm not alone in my opposition. VA does not support this bill either. The department's witness testified that at the legislative hearing on this bill that a new advisory committee on LGBTQ veterans is not necessary. VA currently has 27 advisory committees. VA is already taking a number of significant steps to ensure fairness for veterans from all walks of life. It has completed the IDEA task force review and accomplished several goals of increasing equal and outreach to veterans communities, including the LGBTQ veterans. The department also has LGBTQ veteran condition coordinators in the VA medical centers to focus on the needs of these veterans. The secretary meets with groups and stakeholders regularly, including the LGBTQ veteran groups. VA has also proposed a change in regulations to review the possibility of changes eligibility for veterans given other than honorable discharges under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Beyond that, it is already being done to review these discharges. With these efforts in mind, I agree with the VA and believe this advisory committee is unnecessary. And because of that, I will oppose the bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further debate on the bill? If not, I recognize Chairman Levin, Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 4845 be reported favorably to the House.
Second.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, we request a roll call vote.
Is there a sufficient second?
Second.
There is a sufficient second. A recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to Committee Rule 4, further proceedings on the measure will be postponed. I now call up HR 3730. The clerk will designate the bill.
HR 3730 to amend Title 38.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. HR 3730 offered by Mr. Sablon. I now recognize Representative Sablon.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sablon, you are recognized to speak on your
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. Thank you for including on today's agenda HR 3730, the bipartisan bill establishing a VA advisory committee for marginalized veterans living in the Marianas, the other U.S. insular areas, and in the freely associated states. Veterans in my districts especially, and in the other insular areas, do face barriers to VA services no vet should be forced to endure. Veterans residing in the insular areas and the freely associated states of Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia face highly distinct situations in the lack of service they face only because of their location. And yet, these areas have some of the highest per capita enlistment percentage rates in the United States Armed Services. There are many stories and difficulties veterans in these areas face that are kind of situations that departmental bureaucrats back in Washington can hardly imagine. And so that is why Congresswoman Radwagen and I introduced this important bill establishing a committee to educate the Secretary on the obstacles insular areas veterans face. Each U.S. insular area and each of the three freely associated states will have a seat on the advisory committee, and each would be able to describe the barriers their veterans face in receiving VA services. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, Minority Veterans of America, and the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America support this bipartisan legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this bill and for the committee to report HR 37 favorably to the House. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sablon. HR 3730 offered by you and Ms. Radwagen would create an advisory committee on veterans living in outlying areas and freely associated states, including island territories. The advisory committee would have a variety of members, including experts from the covered geographic areas. The Secretary will be able to consult regularly with and receive the input of this advisory committee regarding administration of benefits and VA programs. And once established, the advisory committee would report annually on the needs of the covered veterans and provide much needed recommendations. I urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan HR 3730. Mr. Sablon submitted the statement. Well, he was here to speak in favor of his legislation. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss HR 3730?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, I want to let you know I support 3730 to create a VA advisory committee on bettering veterans or serving veterans' needs in the territories. For a number of Congresswoman Radwagen, Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon, Congressman Sablon, and others delegates from the territories have honorably served their veterans communities and their constituents who are veterans as well. Committee staff have traveled with many of these delegate colleagues to the North Mariman Islands, American Samoan, and Puerto Rico. We have seen firsthand the disparity and difficulties that their veterans face when trying to access health care and benefits from the VA. The combination of limited transportation options, the lack of local resources, the overlapping federal agency jurisdictions, and the complexities around the VA care in the neighboring foreign nations make the territories very different from the rest of the nation. Unfortunately, the challenges that veterans in these territories face always seem to slide down to the bottom of the VA's priority list. While I am skeptical of new advisory committees, I believe the voices of the veterans in the territories are not being heard. And I share Congresswoman Radwagon's and Congress Sablon's goal of elevating their needs. For those reasons, I want to support this bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss HR 3730? If not, I'll recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
I move to report HR 3730 favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Thank you, Member Boss.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 3730. Mr. Chairman, once again, if I could remind members, we're right on this cuff, and if a person goes off, we want to make sure that we're doing these correctly.
I'm aligned with Ranking Member Boss. I associate myself with your request. Members, please keep your cameras turned on. We're right on the cusp of a quorum. We want to make sure that we're not in violation of the quorum. Staff is authorized, without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. I now call up HR 5607. The clerk will please designate the bill.
HR 5607 to amend Title
Texts were circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Ms. Locken for 5 minutes to speak on our bill.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bost. This bipartisan bill will ensure that families of veterans diagnosed with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease continue to receive appropriate benefits after the veteran's passing. As you know, today, the VA provides dependency and indemnity compensation to the surviving family of service members and veterans who pass away. These surviving family members can also receive a supplemental compensation benefit, commonly referred to as a kicker, in the case of veterans who had particularly severe service-connected disabilities for at least 8 years prior to the time of their passing. The VA recognizes ALS as a presumptive service-connected disease, and due to its progressive nature, it is automatically rated at 100% disability. As such, the only barrier for the surviving family members of a veteran whose life is lost to ALS to getting that kicker is that they have that diagnosis for at least 8 years at the time of their passing. Unfortunately, when you have ALS, you are unable usually to meet the 8-year requirement because the average life expectancy is 2 to 5 years once you're diagnosed. That's why I introduced the Justice for ALS Veterans Act with my friend Congressman Fitzpatrick, co-chair of the Congressional ALS Caucus. Quite simply, this bill extends this increased compensation, this kicker, to the surviving spouse of a veteran with ALS. I know this is very straightforward. It's supported by the Paralyzed Veterans of America, American Legion, the VFW, and more. And it'll have a tremendous impact on the surviving families of veterans with ALS. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you. And I yield back, Chairman.
Members, thank you, Representative Slocum. Members, please, if you're, please mute. There was a lot of interference, background noise. I urge my colleagues to support HR 5607, the Justice for ALS Veterans Act of 2021. I'd like to thank Representative Slocum for introducing this bill, which entitles surviving spouses of veterans who die from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, to receive an additional monthly entitlement known as the DIC kicker. ALS is an incurable progressive disease that results in total muscle paralysis and death. Recognizing that ALS impacts those who served in the military at higher rates, VA declared ALS to be a presumptively compensable illness for all veterans with 90 days or more continuous active service in the military. Spouses of veterans diagnosed with ALS often rapidly pivot to serving as round-the-clock caregivers until the veteran passes away. This impacts their ability to obtain or maintain employment, limiting their ability to bring in an income. And due to the short life expectancy of veterans diagnosed with ALS, most veterans are unable to meet the 8-year requirement for their families to receive the DIC kicker. These families should not be denied this benefit simply based on the fact that the veteran's service-connected disease makes it practically impossible to meet the 8-year life expectancy requirement. These veterans' lives are stolen by ALS. It is up to this committee to ensure the spouses and dependents these veterans leave behind are well cared for. I hope my colleagues will support this legislation. Is there any further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, HR 5607 would extend eligibility for higher dependency and indemnity compensation, or the DIC rate, to spouses of veterans who died from Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. Under current law, the veterans must be rated totally disabled for 8 years prior to death for the survivor to receive the higher rate, known as DIC kicker. I really empathize with the intent of the legislation. The ALS is an illness that ravages families. Many veterans diagnosed with ALS may not live the 8 years required for their spouses to be eligible for the DIC kicker. However, I am concerned that this bill creates two classes of surviving spouses within the DIC program. But extending eligibility only to spouses whose partners died from ALS will set them apart from others survivors who are equally impacted by sudden losses of their loved ones. For example, survivors of veterans with progressive late-stage cancer would not receive this exemption. Like Congresswoman Slocum, I appreciate the concerns about the fairness of the 8-year requirement. And I am willing to examine alternative options to the legislation that would treat all survivors fairly while preserving the intent of the existing statute. However, this bill is not ready for a vote yet today. Moreover, the bill has a projected CBO score of 100 million to 120 million over 10 years in mandatory cost. And that's different than the other CBO score that we saw. I think those numbers are accurate. This bill includes no provision of offset for those costs. And I believe the bill should remain in committee while we identify the best path forward, especially when we have families of toxic exposed veterans also waiting on a proposal that we have no offset for yet. The reality is that the offsets are limited in the veteran space, but there are many bills that the committee would like to pass with high price tags, such as this bill. We should be discussing which bills we need to prioritize for these offsets before putting them on a markup. We must reconcile our competing priorities, including addressing the needs of toxic exposed veterans, and make good on our promises we made to our veterans and constituents. As I previously mentioned, I understand the spouses of veterans with ALS face unexpected heavy challenges. However, if the DIC program needs to be improved, we must take all groups into consideration. This bill does not do that. That is why I cannot support it today in its current form, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Does any other member wish to offer discussion on this bill? If not, I recognize Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 5607 be reported favorably to the House.
Second.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the
Mr.
table.
Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Is there a sufficient second?
Second.
There is a sufficient second. A recorded vote is ordered, and pursuant to Committee Rule 4, further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of HR 5151. The clerk will designate the bill.
HR 5151 to amend Title 38.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. And without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This bill, introduced by Representatives Bilirakis and Christ, amends Title 38 to provide for the transfer of entitlement to post 9/11 GI Bill educational assistance when an individual approved to transfer entitlement dies, with the remaining entitlement after designating beneficiaries, but before fully transferring the benefit. The legislation is named after Colonel Jim Turner, a resident of Representative Bilirakis' district, and will ensure the transfer of GI Bill benefits to a surviving family member when a veteran has died prior to completing the benefit transfer process. This will help military and veteran families afford education or job training in the wake of unimaginable hardship. This bill has the support of the American Legion, Student Veterans of America, and the American GI Forum. I urge all members to support HR 5151, and I recognize Ranking Member Boss to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HR
The
5151.
text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment. Number one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under current law, a service member that has served at least 6 years of active duty and has agreed to serve another 4 is authorized to being transferred their post 9/11 GI Bill eligibility to their dependents. Service members elect this transfer while on active duty, but are not required to allocate their 36 months of eligibility until their dependent began to actually utilize the benefit. Colonel James Floyd Turner served honorably in Iraq and Afghanistan and was a constituent of Congressman Bilirakis. Sadly, Colonel Turner died by suicide in 2018 due to PTS. From his time on active duty, prior to his death, Colonel Turner had transferred his GI Bill benefits to his daughter. However, he had not allocated his eligibility to her before his death. As a result, the VA reclaimed the GI Bill eligibility and denied Colonel Turner's daughter the opportunity to utilize the benefits he had rightfully earned and transferred to her. If Colonel Turner was alive, he could make the allocation to his daughter and she would still have these benefits. This bill would change current law to ensure that if a veteran dies prior to allocating their benefits to their dependents would still be eligible. This bill would also require VA to evenly distribute any remaining eligibility to all transferees who are then allowed to reallocate the benefits among themselves. Congress never intended to penalize these families who have already had to go through so much just because the service member didn't check the correct box on a government form. My first amendment to this bill would offset the cost of the bill by adjusting what type of school a participant can attend and receive the GI Bill funds under the Dependents Education Assistance Program, or DEA. This program provides $1,298 a month to the dependents and survivors of the deceased or severely disabled veteran to offset the cost of their education. Under current law, students are able to receive DEA benefits while attending secondary schools. While this authority may have made sense when the DEA program provided 48 months of eligibility, it simply does not today. That is because in 2019, Congress changed the eligibility for this program to 36 months to match other GI Bill programs. We are putting these students at a disadvantage when they go to use these benefits for higher education and can't fund a 4-year degree because they already used up 36 months of their benefits while attending high school. This change would delay the effective date so current students would not be impacted by it. The proposals have been endorsed by the National Military Families Association and the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, or TAPS, as a common sense change. I want to thank Congressman Bilirakis for all of his hard work drafting this bill, as well as Chairman Takano for including it in today's markup. I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment as well as the underlining bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member Bost. I support your amendment number 1, which would further protect the Survivors and Dependents Educational Assistance Program by limiting usage of the program in high school, ensuring that the benefits are still whole for college. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss Bost Amendment number 1? If not, the question is on Bost Amendment number 1 to HR 5151. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost Amendment number 1 to HR 5151 is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. And I recognize Ranking Member Bost to offer his amendment number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HR
The
5151.
text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As this pandemic was just hitting our shores in March of 2020, I was proud to stand with the chairman, the ranking member Rowe, our Senate colleagues, and many others to help protect student veterans. We acted swiftly to ensure students' monthly housing allowance payments were not cut when their in-person classes converted to online learning. We also extended protections to students, preventing them from being held liable if their school closed or if they were forced to withdraw due to COVID-19. Congress extended these authorities until December 21st, 2021. My amendment would add to the text of my bill, HR 5509, the Student Veteran COVID-19 Protection Act of 2021, to the underlying bill. This would further extend the COVID-19 protection until June 1st, 2022, giving schools and, more importantly, students continued protection for the second half of this academic year. My amendment would also be completely offset by using a 5-month extension of the VA home loan fees that would have been used many times in the past to offset spending on a bipartisan basis. My amendment also includes several needed technical changes to the Thrive Act and the Isaacson-Rowe Act that passed last Congress. These technical changes are needed to ensure that GI Bill students can attend foreign schools to ensure we give US-based schools time to comply with the new reporting requirements. A coalition of 18 higher education groups have advocated for these changes for several months and support my proposal. My proposal is also supported by growing numbers of VSOs, including the American Legion, the VFW, Student Veterans of America, Iraq and veterans of America, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans of America, veterans education success, and AMVETS. I understand that the chairman has language which is similar to mine, but it's not paid for and instead utilizes the emergency spending. The Congressional Budget Office has told us that it would cost this COVID-19 extension is more than $200 million over 10 years. I believe that it is too high of a cost to consider through emergency spending and must insist that we use these offsets as the extension. I understand the chairman's current intention is to pass his unoffset bill through the House, although I believe it would have to be on a bipartisan basis. However, even if the chairman was able to get the his unoffset bill through the House, I don't believe it can pass the Senate by unanimous consent in time to help these student veterans who need it now. It is clear to me that the only way to ensure student veterans are protected and the necessary technical fixes are enacted is to offset the cost of the bill. Mr. Chairman, do I have your commitment to sit down with me and our Senate colleagues and come up with an agreement on how to extend these protections in a bipartisan manner?
Ranking Member Boss, I am more than eager to work with you and our Senate colleagues to find a pathway forward. But I will remind you that that students' educational programs are at stake, their housing benefits are at stake, so that the four of us must come to some pathway forward. And so you do have my commitment to work with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. You know, that's our responsible position that we should take as leaders of the committee. The Higher Education Committee community says that this extension is needed by Thanksgiving. There are only 5 legislative days left between now and then. We may be voting on massive reconciliation packages this week. We may be voting on trillions of dollars of infrastructure package this week. The only way we can have an even chance of getting this extension done before the current authorization expires is to offset it. I have offered an offset to the pay for this legislation in an effort to give a path forward. I don't believe it should be put on government's credit card, and I hope that we can come to that by a partisan or a practical solution in a bipartisan manner before it's too late for the student veterans. With that, I will withdraw my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, I'll just remind the ranking member that we have repeatedly passed this through emergency spending. I think there is ample evidence that the higher ed institutions and our student veterans in many parts of the country, and especially many states that are represented here on the committee, that they are experiencing still high infection rates, and hospital beds are being taken up. I'll also, this is not a jab, but I just wanted to say that we have just gotten estimates back from the White House on the Build Back Better reconciliation bill that actually more revenue is coming in that exceeds the program costs. And so, my hope is that Build Back Better will pass, because there actually may be even a solution to some of these offsets if we have to go that direction. But I will remind the ranking member that we have passed through emergency spending this accommodation for student veterans who need housing.
And I understand that. I'm hoping that we can commit to sit down together and try to get it figured out. I appreciate that.
All I've committed to do that, and we'll. So I thank you for withdrawing your amendment. And so are you withdrawing your amendment?
I am withdrawing my amendment. Yes.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. So the question now is on. We've already.
Mr. Chairman, I move to report HR 5151 as amended favorably to the House of Representatives.
Well, thank you for that motion. All those in favor of the motion will say aye.
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 All those
Aye.
opposed will say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost?
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and descending views on HR 5151 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered. The staff is, without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. And we will now proceed to the postponed votes. We will now move to the unfinished business of the recorded votes which were postponed. Recorded votes were offered on the following measures. Recorded votes were requested on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Levin to HR 1836, the motion to report HR 3944 as amended, the motion to report HR 2916, the Mace amendment to the amendment in nature of substitute to HR 5529, the motion to report HR 1596 as amended, and the motion to support HR 4845, and a motion to report HR 5607. So we will now proceed to roll call vote. So recorded votes were ordered on the 11 amendment nature substitute to HR 1836. Question now occurs on agreeing to the 11 amendment in the nature of substitute to HR 1836 on which a recorded vote was ordered. Clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
I think Levin voted for Lamb. Lamb is an aye also.
Mr. Lambert.
Sorry, Connor.
What's that?
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loria, Ms. Loria,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan, Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Aye.
Ms. Underwood,
Aye.
Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Frankel,
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Slotkin,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye.
Ms. Capter, Ms. Capter, Dr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Bost,
Aye. Gallego says aye.
Mr. Bost is no.
Gallego's aye.
Gallego's aye. Mr. Bost is no. Ms. Radewagen, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Bergman,
No.
Mr. Banks,
No.
Mr. Roy,
No.
Dr. Murphy, Dr. Murphy,
Murphy is a no.
Mr. Mann, Mr. Mann,
No.
Mr. Moore,
No.
Ms. Mace,
No.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a no.
Dr. Miller Meeks,
No.
Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, no.
Ms. Capter, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Cawthorn, and Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk. How is the, Madam Clerk, how is Ms. Capter reported?
Ms. Capter is not recorded.
Is Ms. Capter, does that Capter join the call?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I wish to be recorded aye.
Are there any other members who wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 17 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Vice Chairman Levin for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HR 1836 as amended be reported favorably to the House.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, or dissenting views on HR 1836 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered, and the staff, without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. This is the next one. Okay. Recorded votes were ordered on the motion to favorably report HR 3944 as amended. The question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 3944 as amended to the House. Clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Lamb, Mr. Lamb,
Aye. Lamb, aye.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loria,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Aye.
Ms. Underwood, Ms. Underwood, Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Frankel,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye.
Ms. Capter, Ms. Capter, Dr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego,
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Bost, Mr. Bost,
No.
Ms. Ridewagon, Ms. Ridewagon, Mr. Bergman,
Bergman's no.
Mr. Banks,
No.
Mr. Roy,
No.
Dr. Murphy,
Dr. Murphy's a no.
Mr. Mann,
Man votes no.
Mr. Moore,
Four votes no.
Ms. Mace,
Mace, no.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale, Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's no.
Dr. Miller Meeks,
Miller Meeks, no.
Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, no.
Ms. Underwood,
Underwood votes aye.
Ms. Capter,
Aye.
Ms. Ridewagon, Mr. Cawthorn, and Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 17 ayes and 12 noes.
The motion is therefore agreed to, and the bill is ordered reported, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental, additional, or dissenting views on HR 3944.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendment. Recorded votes were ordered on the motion to favorably report HR 2916. Question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 2916 to the House. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Lamb, Mr. Lamb,
Yes, Lamb, yes.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loria,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Aye.
Ms. Underwood, Ms. Underwood,
Aye.
Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Frankel,
Aye.
This is another yes.
Brown votes yes.
Ms. Locken,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye.
Ms. Capter,
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz, Dr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego,
Gallegos, aye.
Mr. Bost,
No.
Ms. Radewagen, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Bergman,
Bergman's no.
Mr. Banks, Mr. Banks,
Banks votes no.
Mr. Roy, Mr. Roy,
Oh.
Dr. Murphy,
Murphy's a no.
Mr. Mann,
Man votes no.
Mr. Moore, Mr. Moore,
Moore's a no.
Ms. Mace,
Mace is a yes.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a no.
Dr. Miller Meeks,
No.
Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, no.
Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Cawthorn, and Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their votes? Clerk will report the vote. Mr. Sablon, before I have the vote reported, you wish to be recognized?
No, sir.
Okay, your hand is up. All right. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 18 ayes and noes.
18 ayes and how many noes? Can you just repeat the vote?
For this vote, there are 18 ayes and 11 noes.
11 noes. The motion is therefore agreed to and the bill is ordered reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Ranking Member Bost.
Yeah, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental addition. No R dissenting views on HR 1596.
Without objection, so ordered. Recorded votes were ordered on the Mace Amendment to the ANS to HR 5529. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Mace Amendment to the ANS to HR 5529, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
No.
Mr. Lamb,
No. No.
Mr. Levin,
No.
Mr. Pappas,
No.
Ms. Loria,
No.
Mr. Span,
No.
And if Democrats want to get elected,
No.
they need to ask why they are not getting it done.
Ms. Underwood,
No.
Mr. Allred,
No.
Ms. Frankel,
No.
Mr. Brown,
No.
Ms. Slotkin,
Yes.
Mr. Trone,
No.
Ms. Capter,
No, thank you.
On these policies.
Dr. Ruiz,
No.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego,
Gallegos, no.
Mr. Bost,
Yes.
Ms. Radewagen, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Bergman,
Yes, Bergman's yes.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Roy,
Yes.
Dr. Murphy,
Yes.
Mr. Mann,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Ms. Mace,
Mace, yes.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
Yes.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a yes.
Dr. Miller Meets,
Yes.
Mr. Elzey,
Elzey, yes.
Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Cawthorn, and Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes no. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 13 ayes and 16 noes.
The amendment is therefore not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Yeah, I move to report HR 5529 as amended favorably to the House of Representatives.
We still have to do the.
All those in,
We still have the Miller Meeks amendment in the nature of substance.
Yes, that's.
that's what he did.
Mr. Chairman, was that the proper time for that motion?
No, Mr. Ranking Member Bost, we still have to adopt the Miller Meeks amendment in nature of a substitute to HR 5529. So the question now occurs on agreeing to the Miller Meeks amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 5529. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the ANS is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I now move to report HR 5529 as amended to favorably to the House of Representatives.
The question is now on the favorable reporting of HR 5529. All those in favor shall say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. And the motion is agreed to, and HR 5529 will be reported favorably to the House. Excuse me, 5529 as amended will be reported to the House. Okay, so we move on to the next one.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file a minority or supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 5529 as amended.
Yes, and without objection so ordered, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary conforming and technical changes. Okay, recorded votes were ordered on the motion to favorably report HR 1596 as amended. Question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 1596 to the House. The clerk, as amended, 1596 as amended. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Lamb,
Yes.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loria,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan, Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Aye.
Ms. Underwood,
Aye.
Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Frankel,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Slotkin,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye. Aye.
Ms. Capter,
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz,
Yes.
Mr. Gallego, Mr.
Aye.
Mr. Bost,
No.
Ms. Radewagen, Ms. Radewagen, Mr. Bergman,
Bergman's no.
Mr. Banks, Mr. Banks,
Banks votes no.
Mr. Roy,
No.
Dr. Murphy,
No.
Mr. Mann,
Man, no.
Mr. Moore,
No.
Ms. Mace,
Mace, yes.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a no.
Dr. Miller meets. Dr. Miller meets. Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, no.
Ms. Radwagon, Mr. Cawthorn, Dr. Miller meets. Mr. Chairman,
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 18 ayes and 10 noes.
Well, the motion is therefore agreed to and the bill is ordered reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority, supplemental, additional, or dissenting votes, views on HR 1596 as amended.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical conforming changes in the committee amendments. Recorded votes were ordered on the motion to favorably report HR 4845. The question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 4845 to the House. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Lamb,
Yes.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loya,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan, Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Aye.
Ms. Underwood,
Aye.
Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Frankel,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Mr. Brown votes aye.
Ms. Slotkin,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye.
Ms. Capter,
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Gallego,
Aye.
Mr. Bost,
No.
Ms. Radwagon, Ms. Radwagon, Mr. Bergman,
Bergman is aye.
Mr. Banks,
No.
Mr. Roy,
No.
Dr. Murphy,
Murphy's a no.
Mr. Mann,
No.
Mr. Moore,
Moore's a no.
Ms. Mace,
Mace is a yes.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a no.
Dr. Miller meets. Dr. Miller meets. Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, no.
Ms. Radwagon, Mr. Cawthorn, Dr. Miller meets.
Bergman would like to change his vote to a no.
Bergman is recorded as no. And Mr. Chairman,
Chairman votes aye. Are there any other members who wish to change their vote? Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 18 ayes and 10 noes.
Therefore, the motion is agreed to and the bill is ordered reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr.
Thank you, Member
Chairman,
Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental, additional, or dissenting views on HR 4845.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical conforming changes in the committee amendments. Recorded votes were ordered on the motion to favorably report HR 5607. Question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 5607 to the House. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
Aye.
Mr. Lamb,
Yes.
Mr. Levin,
Aye.
Mr. Pappas,
Aye.
Ms. Loria,
Aye.
Mr. Mervan, Mr. Mervan,
Aye.
Mr. Sablon,
Sablon votes aye.
Ms. Underwood,
Aye.
Mr. Allred,
Aye.
Ms. Franklin,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Brown,
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Slotkin,
Aye.
Mr. Trone,
Aye.
Ms. Capter,
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz,
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Bost, Mr. Bost,
No.
Ms. Radwagon, Ms. Radwagon, Mr. Bergman,
Bergman's no.
Mr. Banks,
Yes.
Mr. Roy,
No.
Dr. Murphy,
Murphy's a no.
Mr. Mann,
No.
Mr. Moore,
No.
Ms. Mace,
Mace, yes.
Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Cawthorn, Mr. Nels,
No.
Mr. Rosendale,
Rosendale's a no.
Dr. Miller Meets, Dr. Miller Meets, Mr. Elzey,
LZI.
Mr. Gallego, Ms. Radwagon, Mr. Cawthorn, Dr. Miller Meets, and Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 19 ayes and 8 noes.
Motion is therefore agreed to and the bill is ordered reported, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost,
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional or dissenting views on HR 5607.
without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Well, that concludes the business of the markup. I'm very pleased to see that this Veterans Day, we can once again show our gratitude to all of our nation's veterans by advancing key bipartisan legislation. I thank all of my colleagues on the committee for joining me in passing these bills that will meaningfully impact veterans' lives and truly honor their service. Does the ranking member or any other member wish to be recognized before we adjourn?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud of the bills we've passed on a bipartisan basis this evening, or let's say tonight, and look forward to considering them in the full House soon. And I hope to continue working across the aisle with the chairman and our colleagues to address my concerns regarding the bills that did not pass with bipartisan support today, and to address the costs of any of these bills and report today and report it that were reported today that are higher than anticipated upon receipt of any financial CBO scores. I also sincerely hope that this will be the last fully virtual markup we have in this committee. I'm looking forward to sitting in the room with everybody together. We owe the veterans in this country our very best, and that is impossible, I feel like, to do it from Zoom. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking Member Bost, I want to thank you and all the members for their cooperation and their willingness to adapt to the circumstances. I know the hour is late, but I especially appreciate your leadership and cooperation tonight. And I thank you for the bipartisan spirit in which we accomplished so much in honor of Veterans Day that is coming up next week. So thank you so much.
Here, thank you.
With that, I will adjourn. If anyone else for the good of the order? Otherwise, this committee is now adjourned. Goodbye, Ms. Brownlee. Goodbye, everybody.